Welcome to Shit VCs Say. Thanks everyone for coming. This is really awesome. Just to put this in perspective, the first New York tech meetup I ever went to in January or February of 2005 was literally about a tenth of the size of this room. And that's the New York Tech Meetup, the one that's like 1,000 people that they're scalping tickets to in front of NYU. So the fact that we now have meetups in the boroughs that are bigger than where we started just a couple of years ago, it's really not that far away, is pretty incredible. So I want to make this as interactive as possible, but I will bring up a couple of things. I want to sort of reverse the way things go in the world of fundraising and recruiting, and a lot of us think about outbound. A lot of us think about pitching, right? We had a couple people pitch here. Inevitably, on every panel that I'm ever at, I live in fear of the end of the panel, because there's like 600 people in the audience and they're like at the edge of their seat, ready to get first in line to bum rush the people on the panel. And it's fine. I totally don't mind staying for 5.5 hours after the end of the event. But it's actually the worst possible place you could sort of pitch, right? The panelist is up there thinking about, what am I going to eat? Is there somebody at home sort of waiting for me? Did I feed the cat or the dog or whatever? And they've already been there for 3 hours, and they're giving of their time. And sure, it's what they get paid to do, but there's 800 people sort of crushing them to death to try and sort of get their 2 seconds in, and the whole thing's sort of a mess. So how do you fix that? So I want to talk a little bit about inbound marketing. One of the reasons, I blog because I like to write, very simply. And I don't think you should feel forced to contribute to social media unless you actually like writing or interacting with others, because otherwise it sort of comes off as really inauthentic, and nobody's going to follow you. But a few years ago, I was working at a company and decided it wasn't a good fit. And I had been blogging for probably about 2.5 years at that point, maybe 3. And I just wrote a post that said, hey, I'm a free agent. I'm done. What's anybody got for me? I'm sort of up for anything at this point. Had no idea what I was going to do next. And I got 20 inbound job opportunities from that. And this is not just like, hey, here's an opening. This was, hey, we've been reading what you've been writing for the last 2 years, and we think you might be good for this position. So if you want to come meet us, and it turns out you're not a sociopath in person, we think that this might be a good fit. And that just kind of blew me away. And it really changed a lot about how I talk to startups and advise them about getting attention, how I give career advice. I teach up at Fordham, and I'll be advising a class up at Columbia next semester. And I just think about the whole, how many people here were really, really satisfied by their college's career planning and placement office? Raise your hand, like real high, right? No? Crickets? Yeah, exactly, right? And the whole thing's sort of a mess, right? And I thought about like, well, what if I could teach students to get to this as a goal, right? So that by the time you graduate, you just say, hey, I'm a free agent, and like 20 people offer you jobs. Wouldn't that have been a much better experience finishing off college than putting on a suit that's like uncomfortable, you like borrowed it from somebody and it doesn't really fit right, and you're going around the job fair with your resume and all stuff. And it's not much better today. You're emailing the little apply here button, and it goes into the abyss, and you have no idea if anybody's looking at it or not. And the developers will probably put some tracking link on it, but it doesn't matter because no one ever clicks anyway. So it's really sort of problematic. And we have the same sort of thing that goes on with VCs. and people you're trying to raise money from, right? It's like, how do I get that microsecond of attention? How do I spend, a week obsessing over the subject line that's going to get a response? How do I, conveniently stand by the elevator after the pitch event is over, so it just seems like we happen to be at this elevator at the same time as the investor on the panel, which is actually a pretty decent strategy because you can only fit so many people in an elevator. So you've each divided the ride by only a couple of ways. So how do you get attention when everyone else is vying for the attention of people you need? And the answer is doing something that's noticeable. And I think that a lot of what people talk about in terms of how to pitch an investor or how to hire a client, the whole teaching is very backwards. It's all about outbound. It's all about, tell them about yourself versus get them to come to you. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the kinds of things that I notice and the kinds of things that that I pick up when people wind up pitching me that are really important, and they have a lot to do with what they've done before they even walked into the pitch, before they've even created the PowerPoint, and maybe even before they've even come up with the idea for the company in the first place. One of the most important things for me when I am evaluating a company is this the appropriate team and possibly the best team that I could ever imagine attacking this particular challenge, right? Because if it's not, this is going to be my only bet in the space, right? So, I got to think about, this is the dream team, right? And if this isn't the dream team, this better be the dream up into the right chart on the product that just proves to me that you're the right people doing this. Because otherwise, is this the team that I would ideally draft to do this particular type of thing? So I give you a really good example. When I was at First Round Capital, I backed a company called Single Platform. And Single Platform provides local merchants with marketing tools that drive customers. And that's sort of, pretty general thing. And I had been looking in the local space for a while, and people have built some really, really beautiful loyalty apps and punch card things that also make sounds when you click them, and just very impressive. And you've seen a lot of them when you go to some local merchants in your area, or as I call it, the land of misfit loyalty apps that sits on the counter. The little QR code that you scan, and it's collecting dust, and this other thing that's sort of plugged in. And people have created some really technically interesting stuff to help your local merchants get customers, but no one that was pitching to me could sell it, right? So that's the really hard part. I don't know if you ever tried to walk into a pizzeria and walk out with a check, but it's actually a really hard sales skill, and it's a very unique sales skill. It's not like enterprise sales. First of all, figuring out who in the pizzeria could actually write the check to pay for your app, or whip out the credit card and all that sort of stuff, somewhat difficult, especially during lunch hours and stuff like that. So I met with all these apps and companies and services and all this sort of stuff. And at most, they had like 6 cafes in Williamsburg or wherever. And I was like, how do you get to 10,000? How do you make this a viable business? And then I met Wiley Surly. And Wiley, first of all, I walk into, he was at the co-working space called Soho Haven back at the time. And he had on the whiteboard 5 names and numbers next to those names. And those 5 names were the very poorly base paid, highly incentivized salespeople that he had, and the number of sales that they had completed during the week. And he pointed to the board and said, they break even at 4.5. And at Seamless Web, we were doing 6, and these 2 people over here have done 8 and 9 this week already. And he had 100 businesses signed up for his, marketing service for small businesses before he even took any money from anybody. And I was just blown away because it sort of reminded me of these stories you hear of, like, baseball history when Babe Ruth would hit more home runs than whole teams were hitting. And here's this guy with 100 paid customers in a world where like nobody I met had more than 10. And so I'm trying to figure out how he's doing this. And the first thing he says to me, he says, well, I ran sales at Seamless Web for 10 years. Oh, okay. So he's just whipping out the Seamless Web playbook all over again. He's done this before. And if you're going to invent a team that is all about selling to local customers, who would you pick to lead it? Well, you're going to pick either the VP of sales from Seamless Web or the VP of sales from Yelp. And I don't know, who else has been really successful doing that? It's not very many, right? So, they did wind up doing a terrific job scaling up the sales. They sold to Constant Contact for about $100 million 2 years later. They had tens of thousands of paid customers, 60 or 70 salespeople selling this product when they were acquired. Really, really terrific job all the way through. But it really started out with like who he was before he started. And not only was he doing something that was leveraging what he was best at and what he knew the best, but surrounded himself with the right talent to do that. And it was just really obvious to me. I mean, first of all, he never pitched me. I was out in the market saying to people, I really like the local sales space, but I can't find anybody who can sell. And it wasn't 2 or 3 people before somebody said, oh, you got to meet Wiley. Oh, sales, local, that's the guy. And so he had a reputation for that. So I pursued him. Secondarily, when I went to go talk to him about the business, he said, well, we're not really thrilled about the idea of VCs, and so, we're probably not raising money. And this is different than the way that people say they're not raising when they come and pitch me. Oh, no, we're not raising now. Yeah, you're not raising, but I offered you 2 and 20, you'd totally take it now. So, people try and say they're not raising when they are. But he was actually making money. So he was in a position to not have to raise. In fact, the product that they had was built with a 30-hour-a-week contract developer. It was kind of barely a product, but it was the absolutely minimum viable thing that the customers would buy off on. And his position was, let me do the hard part in my space. The hard part in my space is selling. Let me nail that, and then we'll make some money and we'll backfill the product and we'll hire some developers to really sort of build it out. But if I could prove that I can get this customer on board with something and build a relationship with them at scale, we'll be able to go back to that, right? So he wasn't even convinced that he was going to take venture money. It was only after I helped him hire his first full-time developer that he agreed to even come into the office in the first place and think about taking venture money. So here I am like chasing after this company. And for any of you that have pitched an investor, this is like the dream scenario, right? You're just going about your business is, it's working, and investors are chasing after you, and you get to play hard to get. This is the ideal scenario. And I find way too many folks where, one, I sit in the meeting and I'm like, why are you doing this in the first place, right? Like, are you really passionate about this particular thing? And there's far too many ideas that people are trying to reverse engineer, what they think investors will be interested in, what seems to be hot on TechCrunch, what's, 1 degree of separation away from, well, we're just like Instagram, but something else, and trying to recreate, and get on that similar bandwagon, versus working on what you're really passionate about. The nature of the meetings that I take is completely different when it's just so clear that this is absolutely what this team should be working on. I just had a very difficult meeting with a friend of mine today who unfortunately is shutting down their business. And they basically said, where we went wrong? We were just not the right people for this business. This business demanded a certain level of expertise in this area, and we weren't we weren't those people. We weren't that team, ideally. And I think we've kind of over-glorified, like being the founder versus being a really important part of an awesome team versus learning about an industry, right? We talked about, well, anybody can do anything, and we could sort of teach you how to do this, and we're funding all these, don't go to college, start a company, and all this sort of stuff. But everybody's sort of running around trying to start stuff without actually really having enough experience in these areas to really be the person to launch their particular company. I'm not meaning to dissuade anybody or sort of take the air out of the room around this. I'm saying there's a ton of really interesting problems to work on, but I think people need to walk before they can crawl a little bit. Walk before they can crawl. That doesn't make any sense. Crawl before they can walk. In terms of really honing a particular skill, right? Coming in and saying, look, the challenge in my area is a marketing challenge, or it's a sales challenge, or it's a product execution challenge. And oh, by the way, I've been honing my skills as a product manager, as a user experience person, all this sort of stuff. And I'm totally the right person for this particular job. I funded a company called Chloe and Isabel. It was a direct sales jewelry company. Somehow I wound up investing in 2 fashion-related companies. I barely dress myself, yet somehow these companies wound up appealing to me. And the founder, it was a multi-level marketing / e-commerce play, taking advantage of social networks. They made jewelry. They did in-person sales. They did online sales. The founder paid her way through college selling Cutco knives. Anybody ever sell Cutco knives here or buy a Cutco knife? They're really great knives, actually. You can cut a penny with them. She knows the MLM space through and through. And oh, by the way, she's been in the jewelry industry for the last 15 years and launched fashion jewelry for Old Navy. The tough part in her space was the execution around this particular model. It was knowing which factories in China you could make the best jewelry at. It wasn't building an e-commerce site. It's not the technology behind this. It's knowing that particular area. It's knowing how to train salespeople. And you couldn't really make a better founder than that. And so I find in a lot of situations where the nature of the conversation is really different when you have somebody who comes from a space and comes from a position of knowledge. It's just a sort of night and day kind of thing. And so it's really interesting, I think, that people come in and they wind up pitching me, but 9 times out of 10, I'm just taking their name and going to LinkedIn and saying, who is this? Like, is this the right person to be doing this kind of thing? Does this person, have this sort of, DNA to be doing this? And I think that's really, really important because there's so many things that you're going to need. For example, like business development relationships. Do you know all the key people in the space already, right? Because think about it from a marketplace perspective. I get to fund, 8, 9, 10 out of the 3,000 things that I see during the year, right? So you come in with your smart team, right? And we're all pretty smart in here, right? With a good idea and, some parts of it are working, some parts of it are not, right? But some other team comes in and has this ridiculous, unfair advantage because they already know the customers. They used to be at the customer and have purchased this product before. They have relationships that, average team of smart people coming up with the idea don't necessarily have, right? But the market isn't really necessarily fair. So I'd really, as you're going into thinking about entrepreneurship and thinking about pitching, say, are we absolutely the best team to be doing this? And if not, how can we go find those people? Right? The second half of what I want to talk about is recruiting. Because a lot of you maybe are starting out 1 or 2 people, and you're sort of thinking about the dream team. And I think far too many entrepreneurs actually just sort of take the people around them, and they say, oh, okay, well, this guy was my buddy in college. I met this girl at a co-working space, and we all got really excited about this idea, and we got together. Well, that may optimize for people you like working with, but are those the best possible people you can find and put together? One of my angel investors for the company that I had started said to me, you're successful the day you walk into work and you have nothing to do. Because you've hired people in each of the various areas that are better than you at that particular thing, where you are literally the worst person there. You're the dead weight, right? And you're like, okay, this company's now successful. There's a better marketer than I am. There's a better tech person than I've been able to code. We have a better HR person than I've been able to hire. Awesome job hiring, right? So the key is, like, do you know what that dream team looks like in your space if you don't have them? And think about from a perspective of, like, how you can attract that talent. So here are a couple of different ways I think people go about doing this. First of all, some of you may be working on projects on the side. Some of you may be full-time employed elsewhere. Really hard to get your company going if you're not necessarily working on it full-time, right? But there are things that you can do to associate yourself with the area that you're working in. So, for example, hosting a meetup. Meetups and events are a really, really fantastic way to build a really great network of people around you and be the center of that particular community. So a friend of mine, this girl, Julia, who runs anybody belong to the Arts and Tech Meetup here? A couple people. It's really cool. 3 years ago, she comes to me, and she was working in a startup company, and she was sort of like junior assistant, social media person, didn't really love the job, really wanted to be an arts editor in a magazine. Good luck with that. There aren't as many magazines as there used to be. The pile of unemployed art history majors is like yay big. The statistics aren't necessarily on your side. And I said, well, what's the most innovative part of your space? So no matter what job you have, how many people here are working full-time at a job and would rather be at a startup? Okay. No matter what job you have, you could always find the most innovative areas in your industry. And by definition, there's nobody more experienced than you if you're trying, right? Because they're innovative new areas. No one has any experience with them. It's actually really easy to become the most innovative person and be sort of on the bleeding edge and follow that kind of stuff, right? So I said, okay, in the art world, like, what's really innovative in the art world? Is there some museum trying to figure out, how they can use Facebook to raise money? Trying to figure out whether they should be Instagramming all their paintings or anything else like that, right? Who's doing that at the Met? And are they talking to the people who are doing that at the Guggenheim? Probably not. Is there a conference for that sort of stuff? Can you be the connector? And so I encouraged her to start a meetup about the intersection of arts and tech, because it wasn't out there. And she said, no, you're that person, you're the leader person, I'm the born follower, I don't do that kind of thing. I said, just try it. She said, well, who's going to want to meet me? I said, no, it's not about meeting you. It's about being the connector. It's about bringing these folks together. So she did. By the way, in her first meetup, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Twitter account retweeted the fact that her meetup existed. So she got all sorts of people on there. 70 people showed up to the first thing. It wasn't long before she had 250, 350 people because she hit upon something that was really interesting. 6 months into running her meetup, the MoMA approached her and said, we'd like you to come and do this internship. We'd really like to do some technically interesting stuff at our museum. We'd like to connect to this community of creators. We think you're the right person for that. She wound up doing this internship. 9 months in, she didn't even finish the internship because she wound up getting a job at Vice, which is a really fantastic online cultural property, as an arts editor, which is what she tried to start out in the first place. The meetup is now 3 years old. There's 2,000 people in it. She is one of the top 5 most connected, thoughtful, innovative folks in the worlds of intersection and art and technology in New York because of a meetup. It's not really that hard. And so, when you come in and say, I'm pitching a startup related to data and analytics, like, are you the data team? How are you the data team? How's it really obvious that you're the data team, right? Are key data people in my mind, like, is Hillary Mason introducing me to you saying, you just got to meet this team. It's really unbelievable, right? Can you make yourself that team and be associated with those kinds of folks? Can you do things that get noticed, maybe not necessarily for your startup, but while you're building, right? What kind of interesting, hacks can you do on a weekend? What kind of interesting analysis can you do, right? You're the team that's really into, let's just go back to this data analysis thing, and there's a whole bunch of people talking about the Series A crunch. Well, can you go to Thomson Reuters or Private Equity Hub or any of these folks who have all this VC investment data, Price Waterhouse, and actually create a blog post that statistically proves out the answer, right? That would get all sorts of traffic on TechCrunch and all these other stuff. And oh, by the way, a whole bunch of VCs would notice that you were the team that crunched really interesting data and would start pursuing you. Hey, that was really interesting. Where did you guys get that data? That was really clever of you to do it. Now I'm sort of impressed. Now we're having a conversation that didn't even start with you pitching me a startup. So I'd sort of think hard about the kinds of things that you can do to get noticed other than sending your PowerPoint to a VC by email. Similarly, when you're recruiting, other than pitching somebody at LinkedIn, what can you do to get the people that you want to work with to come to you? That's by being the center of your community. Brooklyn's a really, really great opportunity to do that. I would say half of the tech community probably lives in Brooklyn. And to the extent that you don't have to cart your way back up to, General Assembly or whatever for every event, and you could actually do stuff closer to home, there are probably about 50 to 60 technical meetups in Manhattan around languages and Ruby and Python and all this stuff. There's 3 in Brooklyn. That doesn't actually match where all the developers live geographically. There's a huge opportunity to get in front of the community here and to be a leader here and to be that person that people want to work with. And so I would highly encourage you to think about reversing that model. Right? How do I create an inbound marketing strategy for myself so that the VCs, employees, everyone who I would normally otherwise pitch to comes to me? I'd be happy to take any questions. There's a question.
Charlie, do you feel like the consumer internet space is saturated versus enterprise or?
Is the consumer internet space saturated? I do think that there is way too much internet when I go on. There's just tons of it, and I find it to be really overwhelming. No, somebody asked me before a very similar question of am I still interested in social? There was a blog post that Fred Wilson wrote the other day, things have changed. I sure hope so. I would hope that they wouldn't stay the same, because that would be really boring. Look, models change. I think that people too closely tie things that I don't think are correlated. So for example, the Facebook stock price has nothing to do with whether or not it's hard for Foursquare to raise money. The Facebook stock price to me has more to do with the fact that people are concerned that Facebook doesn't have a real mobile strategy, which obviously is not a concern for Foursquare as to whether or not they have a real mobile strategy. Foursquare is more concerned about whether or not there's an opportunity to make money, whether the growth is still there. I think there's a whole set of individual concerns that people have. One trend, I would say, that consuming and sharing, I feel like we're reaching a little bit of a peak there. I consume a lot and I share a lot, probably more than the average person. We only have 2 eyeballs in our head, and we're only awake so many hours in the day. And so I think it's much more interesting when you can collaborate with people, right? So great, I'm viewing all your photos, and then what, right? So I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. I think GitHub is the new model for stuff, right? How can I connect to you because you're also working on cool stuff, and how can we work together to actually build something? Especially in a world where more and more of us are saying that it's not so interesting to work at a big company anymore. We might as well be like an individual, 1 or 2 person company. And so I think if we're all 1 or 2 person companies, we're going to need a lot more collaboration tools. So I think that's where stuff is interesting. But if you have a viral app that has 40 million users, feel free to come and talk to me about it. But anybody else? Oh, come on, you're all like half of you are in my inbox. If anyone ever, by the way, here's a couple of like 3 tips I'll give you for approaching investors. Email is the best way, but it's really slow. Just because think about what my job is. I give away money for a living, and I put my email address next to it. That's pretty much what encompasses most of my day. But I do try and get to stuff. It's just, kind of a losing effort. If you ever wind up reaching out to anybody by email and they don't respond to you, just forward it to them again. And just say, hey, not sure if you saw this. It's not obnoxious. We're not going to get pissed off. There's a great article that says how to email busy people. And it really is like, hey, we want to hear from you, but we just can't hear all of you at once. It's also a signal, like persistence is sort of a signal for how you're going to act if I fund you. Right? So let's say I fund you and you're telling me we're going to hire a kick-ass user experience team. We're a kick-ass front-end developer. If you email them once and never email them again, you probably won't be able to hire anybody. So being a little bit persistent and being able to get answers in clever ways from an investor is kind of a good signal. Any other questions? The beard was first.
Okay. So there's lots of people coming out with mobile apps and web apps and the internet, and some stuff, of course, become very saturated. Are there any other technologies or trends that you're looking at?
I'm kind of sector agnostic. If you've got something cool, I'm interested in it. Because I could say, hey, I want to do hardware, but there's like some cool hardware stuff and there's some bullshit hardware stuff. And so I don't think it really has as much to do with the industry. I am willing to do stuff with physical products. The physical product space now is really interesting because you can basically de-risk all that upfront overhead through stuff like Kickstarter. And so you can actually tell someone, yes, we have a market because look, we have all these revenues. Now, whether or not you can build the thing and deliver it on time is a whole other issue, but that's, we all know those issues. I'm still waiting for my bike light. But I think there's a unique opportunity, and actually one of the opportunities we haven't really seen yet is industries that need disruption, like healthcare, like education. We haven't really quite seen participation from the industries itself. So for example, like lots of the education-related stuff is from outsiders that don't necessarily know, like you kind of have to know how the old industry works to sort of tear it apart and build it back up again. And I think a lot of the attempts at solving education are just like, the internet's way cooler, fuck education, and then we'll just do it, right? And it's like, well, it's kind of in place for a reason, and the reason why you're interested is because there's a lot of revenues there, and there's reasons why stuff works. So I'd love to see some stuff where, somebody from the industry comes together with an innovative, creative person and says, look, I know how to sell this thing to schools because I've been, selling Blackboard for the last 10 years or some shit like that. And then, but we know how to fix it. There's a lot of opportunity for collaboration because all those industries are in New York, but there's not enough cross collaboration. How much time do I have, by the way?
Yeah, one more question.
Oh, one more question. Okay, 2 more questions.
So how do you know when, so you say like you're interested in knowing when a startup is good. How do you know when a startup is just bad? Are there like sectors that you just don't invest in?
How do I know when a startup is bad? That's really interesting. I've never been asked that question. People always ask, how do you know when it's good? But how do you know when it's bad?
Yeah, what is it like someone gives you a pitch and you're like, okay, this is a sneaker.
Okay. I think a couple of things. Like a couple of the easy elimination screens is like somebody's done this before and you don't know about them, right? Whether or not your idea is bad or not, if you can't learn from the lessons of the past, that just gives me a bad signal as you as a team, right? So if I'm like, well, hey, how's this different than whatever? That's not like a lame VC question. That's like, are you paying attention to your own industry? And if you're like, oh, I don't know those guys, but I'm sure we're way better. No, like pay attention, do the research. You're asking for $500,000. Like you could afford to put in a weekend's worth of work, like, asking around, right? The second thing is, I I think just feasibility. A lot of people, I think, have a really tough time matching resources to milestones. So, you know, it's going to take 3 times as much money and twice as long, or twice as long and 3 times as, oh, it's the same thing. But, you know, look, it's really hard to predict what you can get accomplished. And so a lot of times people are like, yeah, you know, we're going to, like, you know, raise 300 grand to, like, you know, splice alien DNA with regular people. I'm like, I don't really think you can get that done on 300 grand, right? So you have to be really realistic about where you're trying to get to, and also, is that a viable place, right? So the idea could be good, but it could just be it could just take you $5 million to get there. And there's some, to go back to like the Chloe and Isabel example. Chantel came in and pitched a $3 million raise on a PowerPoint for a first-time entrepreneur. And, you know, at first I kind of threw up a little in my mouth. I was like, okay, no. And then I dove into the model. I said, well, what could you do with $1.5 million? And she went and did the work, and it was ugly at $1.5 million. The jewelry was on consignment. She only had like 1 designer. She had a couple of operations person, which is not a good idea in an e-commerce related startups. Like, you just couldn't really do this startup for less than about $2.5 million. And so 3 didn't really make that big of a deal, but at least she did the work. If she would have come in with, you know, sort of, hey, we want to raise 500 grand, that's just totally unrealistic for that type of startup. I think the third and final thing, and I'll leave off with this, is in terms of, you know, whether something is sort of viable enough, I think size of the opportunity is a really big one. Look, I'm a pretty small fund. I don't need you to have $1 billion idea. I have a $10 million fund. I'm looking to do 30-odd startups, you know, putting 300 grand to work in each one, maybe being half of like a 750K round. I'd love it if you had $1 billion idea. That'd be awesome. And I'd, you know, return the fund several times over. But I don't need it to make money. Some funds do. But at the same time, if you're taking outside equity capital and you don't have an idea that you could just at least say this could get to a $50 million exit or something like that, I'm not knocking anybody who has a $10 million idea. If you have a $10 million idea and you can raise next to no money to do it and just sell those $8 to $10 million ideas every sort of 2 or 3 years, that's an awesome lifestyle. And that's great. That's more money than I'm making on a regular basis. That's more money than almost everybody in this room is making. But if you're going to go out and get other people's money to do it and raise a whole team to do it, like, pick something that's big enough. Pick something that, you know, is worth the effort, really. And I see too many people doing ideas that are just, I don't know, like if they won, I wouldn't really be that excited. I think people need to, you know, think a little bigger. You could still build small and think big. And I'm sort of disappointed about the sort of size of the idea in a lot of scenarios. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a crazy idea, but something that sort of makes a lot of impact, I think, is, you know. But anyway, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I'll hang out. I don't have any questions.